thank you for your time this morning, colleagues. I hope it's worth your while. We will be doing quite a bit of interaction using the chat, and we'll do some stuff. If you've got a smartphone handy and switched on, I want to try and demo one or two simple things as we go along. Anne gave an overview of what we're aiming to do, and there are some things that came out as going to be useful potentially, even although many of you will know a number of the things we're going to cover. Each individual will know a different set of things, or a different set of apps or platforms or activities. So we go into this knowing that there are some strands here that you'll be aware of, but we want to try and give a reasonably good overview of the things that might be useful in terms of ensuring quality and in terms of evaluating quality. So we're going to talk about research, some of the tools around engagement, and both the evaluation of individual sessions or the long-term evaluation of the impact of the work. So that's the main focus of our activities. And what I want to do now is to start off with a bit of interactivity and to make a judgment around what you already know or how confident you are already. So what we're going to do is put some stuff in the chat. There are 4 areas of work, and what I would like you to do is rate yourself in terms of confidence. Don't do it yet until I demonstrate. Rate yourself in terms of confidence with a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being not at all confident and 10 being entirely confident. So the 4 areas we're going to work on are engagement, evaluation of sessions, evaluation of long-term work, and usefulness of apps. And what will that look like? What you should be putting in the chat will look something like this. For these 4 areas, if you were very confident on the first one, or reasonably confident, a 6, not at all confident, a second, a 2. For C, it could be 4, D, 7, that kind of thing. So if you look at these 4 areas, go into the chat and type in the level of confidence in engagement, evaluation of sessions, evaluation of longer term work, and useful apps that might support the work. So I'll give you a moment to get into the chat and do that. This is useful to us to balance the time within the session, but it's also useful and is probably a good way of exemplifying a technique for evaluating impact. And although this is about level of confidence rather than knowledge or skill, that's a good starting point. So sometimes starting sessions with asking people about their level of confidence. This is a slightly more complicated one with 4 strands. Often you would do it with 2 or 3 at the top. So if you enter into the chat just now, the level of confidence you have about these 4 areas, and what we will do right at the end is we'll come back to those questions and see if the level of confidence in any of them has changed, and it will give us a sense of impact, but it's also a good model for how you might want to make judgments about quality or impact with your clients. So first area that we want to talk about are some lessons from research, and lessons from research don't initially strike you as something that is a practical and useful tool, but there are some very important things that have come out of learning long term about how remote learning works and about how blended learning works that should give us some clues to delivering with good quality and some confidence around it. So if you look at the research, and some of the research is quite substantive and over a long time. Open University, for example, have been running more than 50 years now, and they evaluate their work regularly. The remote and distance learning service in Australia and other places have a good deal of research. Of course, it's not in our context, it's not in our culture, but there are some consistent lessons that I think should help us focus how we improve what we do with our clients. So the first thing is, in spite of what some English politicians have said recently, there was the government minister for education did say that there's nothing as effective as a teacher standing in front of a class sharing his expertise and the young people sitting in rows. The research wouldn't quite hold that out. But what we do know from research is remote, distance or blended learning can potentially be as effective as traditional campus-based learning. It is all about planning, and it is all about using different skills and embedding different skills with the clients, with the young people. So you're not on a loser to start with. It is about delivering something that's different and finding the skills and the ways to deliver and the ways to engage that make it successful. But there's study after study. There's a very good American study that pulls together the results of over 1,000 different research projects that all show the same thing. There are some different approaches to the pedagogy, andragogy, if you're doing adult education or youth work with a lot of learning. And elements of learning design, planning the experience is a bit different. The usual stuff, making it a social experience, giving good feedback, making sure you're meeting the needs of the individual. So all the stuff that we do normally stands, but there's a few other things about designing it to make it more engaging and more interactive. And what the research does tell us that's fundamental to our work is younger, disadvantaged or less motivated learners in all instances are more likely to drop out. So there's a greater focus, the younger or the more disadvantaged or less motivated the client group, and that is quite often at the heart of our client group, the more things you have to do to motivate them to stay with you. I mean, that's true of live experience as well to an extent, but it's quicker and more obvious when you're working in remote or distance learning environments. The general tips that research points us to is about sessions being shorter and broken up into different activities. There's different parameters around that, but as a general rule, to do any one thing for 15 minutes would be a good general rule. So have discussion for 15 minutes, then go into task for 15 minutes, then come back and report or work in pairs for 15 minutes. That idea of breaking sessions up into shorter, what's called quite often in the literature micro tasks, is a good thing to do. There should also be, in the whole experience, and you have to think of it as a whole experience, not as an interaction in a group on its own, a mixture of synchronous and asynchronous activity. And it's likely that you'll know that term, but for clarity, synchronous is when you're there with the group. Asynchronous is when they go away, they watch a video, they look things up on a website, they read an article, stuff that's not supported live by the tutor. And what they know about distance online and remote learning is that mixture of giving them tasks. So if you would normally have 2 hours available with them, do a 15-minute introduction, give them 20 minutes to go away and read stuff from a website, bring them back. So some of it is with you there and some of it is them working on their own. So synchronous and asynchronous should be a mix in the whole experience. Simpler explanations, because you don't have the non-verbal cues that you normally have. Clearer personal feedback. You'll know if you're working in groups, there's often a temptation to say, most people in the group struggled. If you're doing an ESOL class, you might say most people struggle with the use of hyphens or, commas or whatever. Class level feedback, group level feedback's not that useful. You want to arrange times to give personal feedback and have a lot more individual and questioning and support. And creating a social experience. Chatting to them before, chatting to them after, making sure they feel part of the group, they identify themselves, ideally cameras on till they get to know each other. And if they don't have cameras on, a picture rather than initials coming up on the screen. And the key from research is to say the active engagement, them sitting, listening in a way that they might do if you were doing some group work, is not the way to do it online. It is about them being active and doing things, not necessarily talking, but necessarily doing something that's quite active. So a few more tips that are really based on research is to plan activities, the things you do, not just the input that you're providing. And share the plan in advance. As much co-creation, which is normal for us, but that's quite important. Is about agreeing what the outcomes are, what the activities might be, what they like to do in terms of learning, and model assignments. So if you give them a task to do, if you can reflect back, when I asked you to rate yourself on those 4 questions, it was a bit simplistic, but I showed you what the outline of an answer should look like. That kind of thing is very helpful online or remote at a distance. Flashing a previous answer up on the screen, or if you're asking them to write something, is to give them a previous example to have a look at. Because it gives people a confidence that they're working properly when they do the task or assignment, in a way that if you were in a physical class, you would walk around and nod and say, yeah, that's good, or, you know, you don't need to go on to a second page, or, you know, whatever you might say to them. And using as much questioning as practical, even simple ones, yes, no answers, and with the feedback built into your session. Be aware of their environment. It's a pretty obvious one. They might be sharing rooms, they might be sharing resources, and quite often for the client group that we work with, it might be easier for them to text you in some cases rather than engage through Zoom or through Teams or other media. So you would always want to give them the option of having a discreet way of contacting you. And that might be by phone, it might be by text, it might be in the chat. But ideally you want a private and personal way in the whole engagement you're having with them, so that if they're having difficulties or can't join or are struggling, they find a discreet way of letting that happen. And we've talked about using the chat and using closed questions quite often. The other thing to emphasize that can't happen naturally in a remote environment, in a digital environment, is to explore well-being. So asking questions about how do you feel about this, what do you think, and even simple things like using word clouds, where they type in words, and you know, if 8 people type in words, the word that's typed in most often appears biggest on the word cloud, but it gives you a good sense of how people are thinking about a topic that you're on, or what they're remembering as the key messages. And that kind of thing is good because it gives good feedback to you. It lets them know how their peers are getting on, but it also allows a level of anonymity, so that if they're worried by something, you know it. If they're understanding something, you know it, but you're not asking people to answer personally and perhaps put themselves out there online in a way that they're not happy to do. So pulling out some of the big messages that we want from research to ensure that we underpin good quality experience is plan your engagement differently. You know, the shorter sessions, the more interaction, and try and use active engagement. Get them to type things in, get them to answer questions, get them to nod, get them to hold their hands up, and build in feedback when you need feedback during this session to let you know how it's going, and you need to give feedback to them. So when you plan it, you've got to plan the feedback and evaluation from moment one. And that way you'll be in a position to evaluate better, but you'll also be in a position to know whether they're enjoying the session, whether they're motivated by it, and whether they're feeling that they're successfully progressing, learning, contributing, you know, what you want out of the session. So simple task for you now. In the chat box, I want you to rate from 1 to 10 how useful this part of the introduction, this part of the session has been. Just to highlight the key lessons around research, planning and engagement. So if it wasn't useful, or you already knew all that, put 1. If it's mostly new to you, quite insightful and has things that you can use, go for a 10. So can you rate it now? All you're doing is typing in a single number. Rate it between 1 and 10 as to how useful it is. 1 being the least useful and 10 being the most useful. So if you type that into the chat box now, that'll help us shape things in the future, but it'll also be useful for us to reflect on whether we do further stuff on this or whether we assume this to be known. The heart of today's session is around evaluation of sessions and events, and I wanted to talk about a number of apps, a number of techniques that we could use to evaluate sessions. And sorry, I'm getting an echo. Somebody's mic's on. If you could just check your mic. Yeah, that would be helpful. Somebody's got it. Thank you. And I need to start with a health warning, which is fairly straightforward. All the stuff that we're talking about today are all things that we've seen in practice. They're all things that practitioners have used one way or another. However, you need your sponsoring body, your local authority needs to be comfortable with the apps or with the platforms that you use, and you need to look for and stick to whatever guidance they give. And a simple example is different local authorities, you'll probably be aware of this, have different views of Zoom. You know, it's the one bit of software. Some of them say don't touch it with a barge pole. Some say you can join, but you can't host meetings. Others say you can host meetings. They have to go through checks that give them a level of confidence and give you a level of security that you're not running any risks. So although I'm suggesting that these apps and these platforms are useful to you, you have to check that you're not breaching any guidance to do it. The apps and the platforms, the things I want to talk about though, we've picked particularly because they all allow a level of anonymity. So that you're fairly safe in the world of safeguarding, GDPR, to use these generally. But the cautionary note is look for your employer's guidance or advice if there's any restrictions on using these. In planning of evaluation of sessions of activities, you've got two things happening there. There's your evaluation and there's feedback that you give to the clients as well, to the users, whether it's young people or adults or whatever. You need to plan it so that every interaction gives you some opportunity for you to know how it's going and for them to feedback so that you can speed up, you can drop things, you can change tack. It's quite important to evaluate satisfaction as well as learning or progress, but it's also important to evaluate well-being. The tradition is if you're doing something where there's learning and progress going on, is when you're in a room on a campus-based activity, you evaluate the learning or the progress generally, and the satisfaction and well-being you will pick up through cues and the informal feedback that happens, not so much online. And the reason that satisfaction is the thing that you want to monitor is that is what's going to underline your ability to retain, to keep people on it. If there's a high level of satisfaction, they'll come back. So really what you're doing in judging that satisfaction is making sure that the things you're doing are engaging enough to keep them with you. Online questions and assessments, there's a lot of stuff around and it gives more options for checking learning and progress than ever before. So I think the tools that we're going to use, the tools that we'll talk about, will really give you more of a confidence about the quality and the engagement in your sessions than you would naturally get informally. One of the simple ideas, particularly if you were working with young learners, is to go for the red, amber, green, the traffic light thing. Now, depending how sophisticated you wanted it to be, but basically you want people at the other end with a camera. You do a part of a session, you do 10, 15 minutes, and if things are clear, if they're making good progress, they hold up a green card. I'm not sure an amber card or red, but if they're young, the best thing to do is to say to them, go and find something in the house that's green or orange or red. So they'll come back with a dinosaur or a cushion or anything like that. And it's another way of just making it a more social and engaging activity is, you could give a prize for the most novel coloured item. So there are simple mechanisms like that where they could hold up numbers or hold up colours to give you a sense of, am I going too fast? Am I going too slow? Those kind of cues that previously would have been more obvious if you're physically with them. I like this. I've seen this used before. I like it because it also encourages people to put their cameras on, and cameras on makes it a much more social experience. Using the chat function is probably the biggest tip I would emphasize for the day, and asking lots of yes, no, true, false questions. And you can also, if they are an engaged and competitive group, you can also give them a prize for the fastest answer. So I'm about to demonstrate it. You heard me talk earlier about synchronous and asynchronous. So type in the answer A or B to this question answers in the chat now, and whoever's first with their answer wins the prize of recognition, but no more than that at the moment. So what type of learning takes place without the tutor present in your own time? Is it synchronous or asynchronous? Now I'm hoping Anne's had a chance to look at the chat. Do we have a winner? Who was first with the answer B? Are you there, Anne? Did you spot who was first in with the answer?
Looks like it's Rosalind.
Well
yeah.
done, Rosalind. Congratulations. So that kind of technique of giving, asking them questions and getting a quick answer, that's the type of thing you can do. And you can do it lots of times during a session. And you find particularly younger learners like that kind of thing, and they'll be poised for A or B or 1 or 2 or Y or N if you build in stuff to your either discussion, presentations or written material. Another way of giving feedback, getting feedback and giving feedback is to use emojis, or as they call them in Teams and other things, reactions. So smiles or party hats or whatever that might be. And you'll find, again, younger learners particularly comfortable with that. Ideally, you don't want to be using phones for your communications, but a lot of young people do. And if they've got phones, reactions will pop up all over the place. So getting used to the idea of using reactions or using emojis, and there's lots of ways to cut and paste them, and there's lots of shortcuts. So if you know what tech the people you're engaging with are using, you can just Google, what's the shortcut on an iPad, what's the shortcut, whatever, and just tell them, this is the shortcuts to find these reactions. When I ask a question, you can give me your thoughts by the use of emojis. Post-it style stuff. A fairly traditional way of getting feedback on a session is to use Post-its or something similar. And there's a lot of mechanisms that are available for that online. Most platforms have a whiteboard, and a lot of Microsoft and Google, I think, both call their Jamboards, which is basically a board where you can get an electronic Post-it, for want of a better description, or people can write things. And these are quite good because they're usually easy to work and they're usually anonymous. Although they almost all ask you to put your name in, you can simply say to the people you're working with, put in your initials, put in a number, put in your favourite animal, put in your pet's name. So you don't actually need to use stuff that provides recognition, personal recognition, because if you want the feedback from the group and want a sense of where you are, the anonymity can be quite useful. One of the most useful ones I've found is a free and a really easy to use one called Whiteboard.fi, and that FI is Finland, short for Finland. That's what you get when you go on to it. And although if you look on the bottom left, it does say register. You don't need to register to use this. If you wanted feedback from a class, when you go onto this page, you would simply click New Class. When you click New Class, it will ask you to put your name in, and you don't really need to put your name in. You can put in CLD, you can put in initials, you can put in anything, or you can put in the name of the group. Once you do that, it generates a code. And people that have a smartphone can go on again anonymously and write on the whiteboard. And I'm going to take you through this by showing you a wee practical example. So those of you who have a smartphone to hand, if you go on to Google now and type in whiteboard.fi. So if you get your smartphone, type into Google whiteboard.fi, and it will find a page on your phone, a web page, a landing page, and all you need to do is hit join class. And when you join class, you need to put in the code today, Y3598. So when it asks for your name, don't put your name in, put your initials in, and that'll make it simpler. So if you go on now to whiteboard.fi, hit join class and put in the code Y3598. What I'm going to do, if you bear with me, is I'm going to go on to I'm going to stop sharing for a moment and then restart. And I'm going to go on to the teacher's page, if I could describe it that way, of Whiteboard.
Could you just check all cameras are off, please?
Forgive me, I'm having to reset my shared content. You probably see my machine running a little slow. But I'm just going to show you from a teacher's perspective. So I'm doing the same thing. I'm going to go back to the start and go into Whiteboard once my very slow machine finds it. I have to find Google first. One of the things that you've probably noticed is anybody that uses Teams, once you have Teams running, your own machine can run a bit slower. I hadn't realized it was going to run quite this slow. Okay, so if I put in whiteboard.fi, so when that comes up, now this says resume class. Normally it would just ask me to put the code in as a teacher, but because I set this up earlier, so what comes up as a teacher, as a facilitator, are the student whiteboards. Now, all you do if you've got a smartphone is use it to write on, type the words yes or no or test or something similar, and you'll see that appearing. Yep, got it. Now, that what I demonstrated there was much slower than it works when you're set up. Oh, I like the heart. I like the draw. Yeah, that drawing is definitely me. Yeah. So you can get them to write in comments, views, and you can ask them questions. And the beauty of this is I can, as a teacher, you see the things that you can do there. You can have a lobby. You can lock the room. So once students are in, not that the codes are easy to guess, but you can lock the room so nobody else comes in. You can hide student names. So that takes it off. So even if you asked for student names, you can choose to hide them. You can save all the whiteboards as a PDF. So for your own evaluation, that can come back. You can clear all student whiteboards and invite co-teacher, invite another member in. When you make a room...
John, could you just make reference to the code again to join, and you could respond to one of the questions, which is how do you generate a teacher's code on the whiteboard? Thank you.
No problem. The code is Y3598. If you can actually see the screen, it appears at the top of the whiteboard. I like this. Oh, clever. Somebody's really got the hang of it. I really like this. There's lots of clever things it can do, and we don't have the time to do everything. But if you just sort of go in this for 10, 15 minutes, you would crack all the functioning that you need. How it generates a code is quite straightforward. The minute you say new class, when you go on as a teacher, it just asks student or teacher. When you go as a teacher, it says new class. When you click new class, it opens and the room code appears automatically. So on the page, it just says Y3598. One of the things I like about this one is it keeps the room live for 2 hours, then wipes everything. So there's no history, nobody has kept this information. Yeah, people are getting the hang of different things you can do with it. It took me ages to find those things, and you've managed them in minutes. But at its simplest, you can type things in, you can write things in, you can say a yes or a no, and you'll see the beauty. It takes no time to get on. It's free. I don't know what the limit to the student numbers is, but I've certainly used it with 40, 50 before with no problem. You can use it as many times as you like, and you can print it off. You can wipe it and print it off. So you could ask them 3 questions or whatever using this type of facility. But you see, people have already got the hang of how you import stuff and how you use stuff, and a bit of math. I like that, a bit of art as well. Sorry, we digress a little, but you see how simple it is to use, because these are in effect like Post-its, and I can toggle on. If I wanted to put in a question, I could just do it there, and then I won't take the time to write or type it in, but I could put the question up and then toggle back to the feedback. So it's really easy to use, and people like it because on the phone it's really simple to use. You need no technology really. You can literally write in with your finger, short word answers. And if people are using laptops, you can do the whole thing about using graphics, pictures. You can type in. All that kind of things available. So whiteboards or Jamboards are a really good way forward. I'm going to go back to the presentation. Can I just confirm you can see that there? We're back to the presentation?
Yes, John, yeah.
There's another good mechanism facility you can use called Socrative. There's quite a few around that are good for questions, where you can set questions, you can set tasks. Another one of the good free ones, and I like this because it works well in laptops, tablets, phones, whatever, is Socrative. And it's similar. There's quite a few around like Mentimeter and Kahoot, but they all have slightly different functionality, and really you're better to find the one that works for you. If you went on to Socrative, again, there's free versions that have a lot of facilities. So you can ask multiple choice questions, true, false, short answer. And you can see there's different settings. So you could ask 5 questions, you could shuffle them, you can give instant feedback. So instant feedback is where you might ask a question, and if it was A, B, C answers, A was correct, it would say well done, B was wrong, it would explain why it's wrong, C's wrong, explain why it's wrong. You can type those in. You can do it anonymously. There's a raft of things. Again, if you went on and did a quiz, you would find out how easy it is to use. These are screen grabs of it. And if you do a quiz, the beauty of that kind of thing is you, as the person that's leading the group, can then look at the responses. So although that's a real simplistic one, you can see that what I taught, what they learned and answered in question 1 or 2, everybody got. Nobody got 3, so I didn't teach it right. That's what that tells me. And I need to do it differently next time. 4, I need to give a bit more explanation, or there could be individual students struggling. But you see, if you imagine that with 8 or 10 people on it, that feedback to you tells you something about how well you've taught it, as well as how well they've understood it. So getting that type of feedback is useful. And again, when you go on to this, it generates a code automatically. You'll see near the top of this page, there's a layered 8361 in the blue band. Once you generate a Socrative account, you keep that code forever, so you can just reuse and reuse it. And if you're using it with the people you're engaging with, they only need to get it by email once. There's another one similar called Poll Everywhere, which is quite good for voting, surveys, word clouds, that kind of thing, competitions. It's got a bit more functionality. So if your students are on laptops that have got, a bit more facility on them. It means there are different types of quizzes, different types of competitions you can use. But again, another freebie and another one that's very intuitive. I'm a big fan, and I could say this with confidence, of all the things that I'm highlighting here. You don't need to go on and watch a 1-hour video to learn it. You need to go on for 10 minutes, have a go, and you'll get the basics straight away. Once you've got the basics, you may want to do, some stuff with bells and whistles on it. But you can keep the results, and you can do them all without names. You can use initials or those kinds of things, so that there's a level of security and anonymity about the process, so that only you will get the feedback and only you will use the feedback. So the main apps and software that might help are the ones I've talked about: Socrative, Mentimeter, Kahoot, Poll Everywhere. There's a couple of others called Miro and Mural, which are good. They are more sophisticated to use, but they give you more sophisticated stuff. But if you were working with a group that were enthusiastic and going to be with you for a long time, so if you were doing ESOL, for example, it may be worth going on to a Miro or Mural to have a look at those. But they simply give you better feedback and more options. I tend to like the simpler ones. The only restriction, Kahoot has now reduced the number of quizzes you can have and the number of people that can sign up on the free one. So my recommendation is, if you're using any of those, Socrative or Mentimeter are probably the two simplest, with a lot of the facilities on the free model. What we've talked about is primarily mechanisms that are going to help you in adult learning and youth work for engagement. Anne's now going to pick up and talk about some other stuff that you can use in community development activity. So over to you, Anne.
Thanks, John. And there's three areas really that I'm going to reference as part of this. I mean, we know that there is a wide range of technologies that can support community development engagement. So three that we're going to reference is around the console, which COSLA are very much promoting, around the national standards and voice, and a website. If you have a look at Insight, we'll introduce you to that site as well. You could move on, John. So Console, we believe, originated in Italy, and it's a participation tool for open, transparent and democratic government. It's used widely. Console report around 35 countries are using it, 135 institutions, 90 million citizens are using Console. I mentioned that COSLA are very much supporting, and we've, Education Scotland have had dialogue with COSLA around this. So we believe around 29 local authorities are registered to use Console at the moment, and encouraging more use of that as a platform for community engagement and community development. Yeah. The national standards for community engagement recently updated. I'm sure you're all familiar with the national standards. I'm certainly finding that more and more use of them currently, as local authorities are moving towards developing their CLD, 3-year CLD plans, which are due on the 1st of September. So I'm hearing more and more the use of voice and the use of the standards. So I would encourage you to revisit the update. And we know that the 7 standards are around inclusion, support, planning, working together, methods, communication, impact. Certainly a useful resource for community development and to encourage that learner participation, community engagement there. The last platform I'm going to make reference to is Involve, and another area that's certainly worth having a look at. Involve supporting campaign for new ways to involve people in decision making in their lives. And they focus on 3 main areas they work. It's around making the case, demonstrating why it's important, about embedding good practice, and pioneering innovation and practice. So really links to a lot of the things that John's been talking about throughout the session about research, how important the research is, how important it is to gather the views of learners and what's working and best for you, but also about pioneering and sharing what's working. So certainly worth having a look at the website. You can see the page that John's just shown there around digital tools database to have a look about, what resources might be best, in your situation. So another useful resource for community development. There are things to consider, and I think, the first point, take guidance from your local authority about what you can and should use. I certainly noticed in the chat function, one person who was trying to use their local authority smartphone who didn't allow them access to one of the platforms that John was highlighting. So that's just a prime example of you need to take guidance from your local authority about what you can and should use. And we all know, there have been some difficulties around the various platforms that we use just for communicating on a daily basis at the moment. Generally, don't be tempted to use common social media, like using Facebook rooms, possibility of privacy, inclusion, safeguarding, etc. risks. And again, we've covered that quite a lot throughout this webinar to think about that. Careful use of the camera needed. Again, I would emphasise, we're included in that, and because the session is recorded, the importance to keep the cameras off and that, anonymity and when it's appropriate to use and not appropriate. Remember, it's a social experience. Engagement and retention rely on this. So please test out and try and experiment with some of the examples that we've shared with you today in terms of approaches. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to go into the chat function, and I know some people were getting lots of chats up, so you might want to take just a wee note of how you want to respond to this question in the chat function and wait until some of the chats go down, but it'd be really useful for you to consider your responses to this. Did you know the feedback on this information already? Was it familiar? Are the tips new? Or are they nearly all new? And we'll pick up on some of the chat questions that are coming up. I'm taking a note of those throughout. Okay, thank you very much for that. So the last section I'm going to talk about is substantive evaluation. And I'm talking mainly about how good is our Community Learning Development 4th edition, which I'm sure you may or may not be familiar that HM inspectors have been updating that at the moment. And we have had quite a bit of engagement with the sector in the development of the new edition. And we are using the quality indicators at the moment in our engagements with local authorities. So I would encourage you to have a look at this. We are intending sharing a beta version, perhaps just only some of the QIs, April, May. So look out for that. And as I mentioned, with our engagements in local authorities, we are starting to introduce some of these quality indicators, particularly around leadership and direction, given you're working towards developing your CLD plans. So what we're saying is be clear about your intentions and planned impact. It is central to planning and evaluation. So upfront, give consideration to this. Consider safeguarding, inclusion and access needs to be considered in a different context, particularly at the moment, with such a lot of remote and blended learning taking place. There are, on a positive side, very simple ways to get feedback as you go along and evaluate wider experiences. And John's highlighted some, and I'm sure that there are many others that you're already using successfully. How good is the 4th edition, which is in draft at the moment, currently has 16 quality indicators in 3 sections, and they sit under 6 core questions: performance and outcomes, management and delivery, leadership and direction. And each QI has 3 themes with an illustration of a very good and a range of challenge questions to support that self-evaluation for continuous improvement. So the next few slides I've just chose, this is the slide, the overview of the 16 and what they look like at the moment. And as we said, the presentation will be shared so you can have a closer look at this. What I've done is I've chosen a few quality indicators and a few challenge questions for you to think about that may help support you with this area of work. So the first one's around performance and outcomes. And you can see there in 1.1 that is about performance against aims and targets. So remember, we were saying it's important for you to think about the intended outcomes, what you hope to achieve, and think about what's the best evaluation methods and engagement to demonstrate that you've actually met these. So here's one of the challenge questions that I've chosen. Overall, how well can we demonstrate the collective impact of our work on learners, groups and communities in the wider area? How systematic are we in using this data to inform planning for improvement? So ask yourself that and think about it, and think about some of the evidence that would demonstrate how good you are at that, or where there might be room for improvement. Improvements in equality and equity. So there's another couple of challenge questions here. How well do we evidence increased life chances for learners, including our contribution to closing the poverty-related attainment gap? Think about that. Work with others discuss, look at your evidence. How do we know that we're effectively identifying and addressing barriers to participation? Now, again, we talked a lot about that, you know, thinking about how you can be more inclusive, thinking about the wider needs of learners. How do you know what's improving and that those we work with are included and progressing? How do you know? How are you asking? How are you getting that information back from learners? 2.2, so this is more challenge questions here around improving learner outcomes. I'm not going to read all these challenge questions out. As I said, that there can be between 8 and 12 challenge questions under each quality indicator. And, you know, you can use some, all, a mixture across QIs, which best meet your needs to look at the work that you're doing. So we've got improving learning outcomes, quality indicator there, and we've got improving life chances. So think about these and consider. The last one, quality indicator I've chosen, is around leadership and direction. And how effective is the leadership improving outcomes? And this one's about securing improvement. So how do we know that the outcomes for learners and communities are improving as a result of our quality assurance processes? What are your quality assurance processes? You know, one of the reasons that you're here today is to learn a bit more, and hopefully you're going to get some tips and some useful areas of research that you might want to look closer at to improve that. Also consider how well you support staff and volunteers to understand your role in quality assurance. You know, is there a clear understanding across all those that you work with? Is there regular, robust self-evaluation practice? And lastly, how well do you use research and sharing effective practice to reflect on and improve your own practice and performance? So we began this session with talking about research. So important. Thanks, John. So further reflections to support improvement. Do staff and volunteers know enough about research and helpful evidence? About using technology, the technology? How confident are they? Pedagogy, Andragogy, learning design, learning analytics, using data, all the things that we made reference in the last hour. Monitoring wellbeing and where to find guidance and advice. Do you all know where to go and find guidance and advice? You know, do volunteers know? Do staff know? So this is the last rating that we're going to ask you to do. So in the chat, try to rate your level of confidence in the key areas that we've been looking at on a scale of 1 to 10. So similar to how we began, we would like you to end by providing a rating around these 4 areas: engagement, evaluation and session with clients, evaluating the longer term work, and useful apps that might support your work. Thank you.
And just as you're completing that, it's an interesting point to reflect on that, the previous slide. When we have part-time staff, when we have volunteers, they're not hugely enthusiastic if you tell them they have to go on to YouTube for an hour and watch a instruction video on Mentimeter or whatever it has to be. The selection of these apps, if people are going to adopt them, needs to be on their ease of use, both for the member of staff and the user. And ideally, you want to pick platforms or apps that you can intuitively get the hang of 10 or 15 minutes, that you don't need the instructions for, which is why we've concentrated on those ones. They're not the only ones that are available, but they are probably the most intuitive and simplest to use. And the other thing is to be sure that if they use platforms and apps, that they work, whether you have an iPad, whether you have a phone, whether you have a high-tech laptop with all singing and dancing activities on it. So it's good to know that the ones that we've referred to have been tested in all platforms and have an element of ease of use, and give you the chance to do things with a level of anonymity, which means you're safe and the users are safe. And those are the kind of main criteria for the ones that we picked.
That's great. Thank you very much, John.